They laughed at me when I gave her a second chance. But then she did the unimaginable. I never saw it coming. Life had always felt like a steady march, hard work, family, and simple pleasures. I imagined myself growing old with the woman I loved, watching our kids thrive, and retiring into peaceful bliss. But that dream shattered in an instant. I'm Jim, 38 years old, a mechanic by trade. I fix everything from cars to construction cranes, whatever needs a steady hand and a problem solver's mind. My life was simple but good. I had a solid job, a beautiful wife named Carrie, and a son, Jimmy, who lit up my world. We bought a house, made plans for the future, and tried to hold on to those fleeting moments of happiness. It was the perfect life, until it wasn't. Carrie and I seemed happy at first. We made plans to buy a bigger house after Jimmy was born. I poured everything into my work, hoping it would bring us closer to the life we dreamed of. But looking back, I see how I missed the signs. I never noticed how distant Carrie had become or how she started to belittle me. She called me a funny little monkey after I dirted her shirt once, and it became her favorite insult. I laughed it off then, not realizing that these little jabs were the cracks in our foundation. She wanted more money, more excitement, more of everything I couldn't give her. She wanted a life beyond the one we built together. I was too busy working, too content in my simple life to see it. The day she told me she was pregnant, everything changed. My heart skipped a beat. She wasn't smiling, and her eyes were red, but I hugged her, overjoyed. That's when she dropped the bomb. "It's not yours," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm leaving you for Greg." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Greg, the guy she always defended, the one I tolerated at parties because he brought expensive whiskey? He was the one who had stolen her heart? Couldn't breathe. My world crumbled as she stood there, cold and detached. Before I could even react, she was gone, packing her things and leaving me standing there in the wreckage. I wanted to scream, to break something, but I didn't. Just watched, helpless. Couldn't let it go. My thoughts were a whirlwind of rage and confusion. I drove to Greg's place, slammed my fists into his door, and knocked him out. The next thing I knew, I was in jail. Carrie got a restraining order against me, and just like that, she was gone. A week later, I got the divorce papers. I never even got to ask her why. My world had been ripped apart, and all I had left was the small glimmer of connection with Jimmy. I watched him from my bay window as he played outside, the other kids surrounding him. He looked up at me, his face breaking into a smile, and for a second, I thought everything would be okay. But it wasn't. If Carrie saw me, she'd drag him away. But Jimmy, he always found a way to say hello. It hurt. A 10-year-old shouldn't have to understand the complexity of adult betrayal. But he did. He knew what had happened between his mother and me. He understood that Greg had become his stepfather. I tried to make up for it. I slipped Jimmy a phone, one that was supposed to be for kids over 12, but I gave it to him early. I wanted to stay in touch. I left him a note, saying that I missed him and that I loved him. But I wasn't allowed to contact him directly, not with that restraining order hanging over my head. Still, every time he would text me, I felt a tiny spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could still be his father even from a distance. The months that followed were a blur. Each day felt like an eternity, as if time had slowed down just to torment me. I was no longer just grieving the loss of my marriage. I was grieving the loss of the future I thought I had with Carrie. I never expected it to end like this. I spent my days in the garage, fixing whatever needed attention, while my mind was constantly spinning. It was hard to focus. How could I? My life had just been ripped apart by the woman I trusted the most. I still remember the first time I saw her after the divorce. Carrie showed up unannounced at my door, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She wasn't the same person I had married. That woman was strong, confident, and sure of what she wanted. This woman was broken, desperate, and defeated. "I've made a huge mistake, Jim," she said, her voice cracking. "Greg, he's not who I thought he was. I thought he could give me everything I wanted, but he didn't. I left you because I thought I needed more, but I was wrong. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. More? What about me? What about the life we built together? What about the family we were supposed to raise?" She was asking for forgiveness, but how could I forgive her for throwing it all away? But I didn't say anything. I just stood there, cold, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to consume me. "I can't just forgive you, Carrie. You didn't just leave me for someone else, you tore apart everything we had. You left me for Greg, a man who was never good enough for you, let alone good enough for us." I could feel the anger rising in my chest, but I fought it. I wasn't going to lose control again. She looked at me, and for the first time since it all happened, I saw something resembling guilt in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Jim. I didn't think it would go this far, but I'm asking for a second chance. For our family. For Jimmy and Allison." It was like a punch to the gut. She was asking for forgiveness, not just for herself, but for the children. My children. My son, Jimmy, who was still caught in the middle of our chaos. And now, Carrie was asking me to take her back, as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't betrayed me. "I'm sorry, but I can't," I replied, my voice steady but heavy. "What you did, it's unforgivable. You broke me, Carrie. You broke us." Carrie's face fell, but she didn't leave. She just stood there, her eyes filled with tears, as though she was hoping I would change my mind. But I wouldn't, couldn't. She begged me to take her back, to give her another chance, but I knew in my heart that I couldn't. The love I once had for her was gone. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with, was gone. And in her place was a stranger who didn't care about the consequences of her actions. She left that day with nothing more than a promise to try and make things right for our kids. But deep down, I knew there was no going back. Not after everything that had happened. But I wasn't alone in this. I had Jimmy. He was still my son, no matter what. Every time I saw him, I tried to push my pain aside and be the father he deserved. I would sneak him the phone, sending him little messages, just to remind him that I was still here. Even if Carrie didn't want me to be, I couldn't be the father I wanted to be. Not fully, not yet, but I could still be a presence in his life. One day the phone rang. It was Jimmy. His voice was shaky, filled with panic. "Dad," he whispered. "Greg hit Mom. He shoved me too. You have to come help." My heart sank. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I grabbed my coat, ran to the car, and drove to their house, ignoring the restraining order that still hung over my head. I wasn't about to let Greg hurt my son. I wasn't going to let him hurt Carrie either. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar, and I could hear yelling from inside. I pushed it open, and there he was, Greg, the man who had replaced me, the man who had torn my life apart. He was standing over Carrie, his hands clenched into fists. Without thinking, I charged at him, shoving him down the stairs, not caring that the police would likely show up. He deserved it. He deserved far worse. But I couldn't afford to get arrested again. Not now, not when Jimmy needed me. "Call 911, Jimmy," I shouted, trying to get control of the situation. But all I could think about was protecting my son. My mind was racing as I shoved Greg out the door and onto the lawn. I didn't care if the neighbors were watching. I didn't care about the consequences. Jackson, a neighbor, came over to check on me, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You good, Jim?" he asked, trying to keep things calm. But the reality of what had just happened settled in. Greg hit Carrie and shoved Jimmy. "I had to do something," I replied, trying to catch my breath. The police arrived shortly after, and Jackson vouched for me, telling the officers what had happened. They didn't arrest me, but that didn't mean I was off the hook. The restraining order was still in place, and I still had no rights to Jimmy. As the ambulance took Carrie and Jimmy to the hospital, I was left standing there, alone, broken. The one thing that had been holding me together was slipping through my fingers. The weeks following that night were a blur. Carrie was still in the hospital for a few days, recovering from her injuries. Jimmy was with her parents, staying away from the chaos that had turned our world upside down. I tried to focus on work, but the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening. I was helpless, angry, and heartbroken. Every time I saw Jimmy's face, his sad eyes and quiet demeanor, it tore at me. I still remember the day my lawyer called me with the court date. The restraining order was going to be lifted, but only after the hearing. There was no guarantee that the judge would allow me to have contact with Jimmy again. Carrie had made it clear that she didn't want me near him. She was still bitter, still angry, and still convinced that Greg was the better choice for her. The day of the hearing, I tried to prepare. I knew I had to make a good impression. I shaved, bought a new suit, and tried to look the part of a man who had his life together, despite everything that had fallen apart. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread as I walked into the courthouse. Every step I took felt heavier than the last. When I stepped into the courtroom, I was greeted by the stern face of the judge, who looked at me as if she could see right through me. There was no time for pleasantries. The judge immediately got to the point, asking me why I should be allowed to see Jimmy again. The question stung, but I held my ground. "I want to be a part of his life," I said, my voice steady. "He's my son. I've always been there for him. I made mistakes, but I love him more than anything. I have the right to be in his life, to protect him from what's happening with Carrie and Greg." The judge looked at me, studying my words carefully. "But you violated the restraining order," she said, her voice cold. "That's a serious offense." "I know," I replied, my voice quiet, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I had to make sure Jimmy was okay. He called me for help. He was in danger. I wasn't going to let that slide. The judge took a moment, glancing at Carrie, who was sitting with her lawyer at the other side of the courtroom. I could see her eyes were red and puffy, like she hadn't slept in days. But there was no sympathy in my heart for her. Not anymore. Carrie's lawyer tried to argue that I wasn't fit to be a part of Jimmy's life. He painted me as a danger, a man who couldn't control his emotions. But I wasn't going to let him get away with that. I knew that this was my chance. If I lost this fight, I could lose everything. My son, my dignity, my future. The judge took everything into consideration. The restraining order, the altercation with Greg, my violation of the law. She weighed it all, then turned her attention back to me. "I'm going to lift the restraining order," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "But I want to make it clear that you need to follow the rules. If you violate this agreement again, there will be severe consequences." I felt a rush of relief flood over me. Finally, I could see my son again. Finally, I could be the father I was meant to be. But the weight of everything that had happened still loomed over me. I wasn't sure if I could ever truly forgive Carrie, or if I could ever forget the pain she caused. But I couldn't let that stop me from being there for Jimmy. He needed me. As I walked out of the courthouse, I saw Carrie standing by the door. She approached me slowly, her face etched with guilt. "Thank you for coming that night," she said, her voice trembling. If you hadn't, I don't think the police would have arrived in time. Greg could have killed me. I didn't know how to respond. The words caught in my throat. She wasn't sorry for what she had done to me, but she was sorry for what had happened with Greg. It didn't change anything. Not in my heart. I wasn't going to let my son get hurt, I said, my voice firm. But that doesn't change what you did to me, Carrie. You left me for him. You took everything I worked for and destroyed it. Carrie started crying then, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her regret. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Jim. I was confused. I thought Greg was the answer. I thought I was making the right choice. I looked at her, my heart hardening. The right choice? You tore our family apart. You chose him over me, over Jimmy. She flinched at the words, but I couldn't stop them. I couldn't stop the bitterness that had built up over the months. I had tried to move on. I had tried to forgive, but the pain was still fresh. The wound hadn't healed. We stood there in silence for a long moment, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Then, to my surprise, Carrie spoke again. I know I can never make it right, Jim, but I'm asking for one thing. Can we at least be friends for the sake of the kids? The words were like a slap in the face. Friends? How could I be friends with the woman who had shattered my world? How could I be friends with someone who had betrayed me in the worst way possible? I can't. Be your friend, Carrie, I said, my voice low. I can't pretend like everything is okay. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't let myself feel sorry for her. Couldn't. Not after everything she had done. It felt like my life had been turned upside down, and I wasn't sure how to put the pieces back together. Even though the judge lifted the restraining order, allowing me to finally be with Jimmy, the emotional toll of everything was eating me alive. Every day, it was a battle to stay sane, to not let the bitterness and anger swallow me whole. But I kept going for him. I kept telling myself that as long as I had Jimmy, as long as I had the chance to be a father to him, everything else could be dealt with. But Carrie's persistent presence in my life, even if only through the kids, was a constant reminder of everything she had done to me. The first day I saw Jimmy again after the hearing was surreal. He was waiting outside his grandparents' house, bouncing on his toes, his usual excitement barely contained. The moment he saw me, his face lit up, and I felt a surge of emotion in my chest. This was my boy. This was the reason I'd kept fighting, even when it felt like everything else had crumbled. "Dad!" he shouted, running toward me. "You're back." I bent down and caught him in a tight hug, almost as if I was afraid he might slip away from me again. I held him for a moment longer than I should have, not caring who saw. It was just him and me, just like it used to be. "I missed you so much," I whispered, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. We spent the day together, taking things slow, talking like we used to. But no matter how much time we spent together, something in me kept pulling back. The pain of Carrie's betrayal lingered in the back of my mind, and I wasn't sure I could ever really let it go. The thought of her with Greg, the man who had taken my place, made my stomach turn. But I didn't want Jimmy to see the cracks in my composure. He needed to feel safe with me again. Later that evening, when we were sitting on the couch watching TV, I was jolted out of my thoughts by a knock on the door. I knew it was Carrie before I even opened it. Her presence in my life was a constant shadow now. She wasn't just physically there. She was emotionally tangled in every decision I made, every action I took. "Jim," she said, standing on the doorstep, her voice a mix of hesitation and determination. "Can we talk?" I didn't want to. I didn't want to have any more conversations that left me feeling like I was in the middle of a battlefield. But there was something in her eyes, something that made me feel like I couldn't walk away. "I don't have anything left to say, Carrie," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But she pressed on, her voice softening. "Please, for the sake of the kids, can we at least talk like adults?" I glanced over at Jimmy, who was still engrossed in his game. He didn't seem to be paying attention, but I knew better. He was always listening, always watching. So, reluctantly, I stepped aside and let her in. We sat down on the couch, facing each other. There was an awkward silence between us, an uncomfortable tension that felt like it was about to snap. I didn't want to hear her excuses, didn't want to relive the pain of the past few months. But there she was, asking for a second chance. "I made a mistake, Jim," she said, her voice shaking. "I know I hurt you. I hurt everyone. But I was confused. I thought I needed something else, something that you couldn't give me. But now I know. I was wrong." Her words echoed in my mind, but they felt hollow. How could she just come back and pretend like everything was okay? How could she expect me to forgive her for destroying our family? I didn't speak for a while. I just stared at her, wondering how I could have been so blind. How did I miss the signs? How did I not see her slowly drifting away? She was right. There was a part of me that had failed her, that hadn't been present when she needed me the most. But that didn't excuse what she had done. "I don't think you understand," I finally said, my voice colder than I intended. "You didn't just leave me, Carrie. You left our son. You broke everything. You betrayed me in the worst possible way. And now you want me to forgive you? Just like that?" She looked down, tears streaming down her face. But I didn't feel sorry for her anymore. I was done feeling sorry for her. She had made her choice, and now it was too late. "I'm sorry, Jim. I can't undo what I've done. But I still care about you. I still care about Jimmy. And Allison." She hesitated, her voice cracking. "I know I've hurt you, but can we at least try to be a family again? For their sake." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. For a moment I was back there, the man who had loved her, who had believed in our future. But then reality came crashing down. She had already made her choice. She had already left me. The family we once had was gone. "I can't do it, Carrie," I said, my voice firm. "I can't go back to that. You made your choice when you left me. And now, no matter how much you beg, I can't go back." She looked like I had slapped her. Her face crumpled with the weight of her own guilt. And for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything. I remembered how she had torn my life apart, how she had made me feel like I wasn't good enough. "I'm sorry, Jim," she whispered again. But I didn't respond. Couldn't. It wasn't just about Carrie anymore. It was about me. It was about finding a way to live again, to move on from the wreckage she had left behind. I couldn't let her back into my life, not in the way she wanted. I stood up, ready to walk away from it all. I need to focus on being a father. That's all that matters now. She didn't say anything as I walked past her, heading back to the kitchen. The days that followed the conversation with Carrie were filled with a strange sense of calm. I thought the worst had passed, that I had finally drawn the line in the sand. But life, it seems, has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. I had managed to get into a routine with Jimmy. We spent the summer together, me doing the best I could to be the father he needed while juggling the reality of his mother's absence. But still, there was something off. Every time I thought I could put the past behind me, Carrie's face haunted me. Her voice, her plea for forgiveness. And then, one afternoon, the phone rang. It was Jane, Carrie's mother. "Jim," her voice was urgent. "You need to come to the house. Carrie, she's gone." The words didn't register at first. I stood there, the phone in my hand, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Gone? Where had she gone? What did she mean? She left the house in the middle of the night, Jane continued, sounding frantic. I don't know where she is, but I need you to come. Jimmy's worried. We all are. I didn't know what to think. This wasn't just some petty argument or a routine fight. This was something different. Carrie had vanished without warning, without a trace. The woman who had been my world for years, who had torn it apart, was now the one who had disappeared into thin air. I drove to her parents' house, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. When I arrived, I found Jane sitting on the porch, her face drawn with worry. Jimmy was inside, pacing up and down, clearly on edge. Where's Mom? He asked the moment he saw me. His voice was shaky, filled with confusion and fear. I didn't know how to answer him. How could I tell him that his mother had left without a word, without a goodbye? I wasn't even sure what was going on, but I knew I couldn't lie to him. I don't know, Jimmy, I said, kneeling down to look him in the eye. But we're going to figure this out. I promise you. Just then, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Carrie. I opened it, and the words hit me harder than anything I could have imagined. Jim, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you, but I'm done. I can't be the person I was. I'm leaving for good. Don't try to find me. I've made my peace. The kids are yours. I've signed the papers. Goodbye. The message was short. It was final, and it didn't answer a single one of the questions that were running through my mind. What had happened? Why had she left? Where was she going? I showed the message to Jane, and her face crumpled with disbelief. She can't just leave like this, she whispered, more to herself than to me. Not after everything. But Carrie had made her choice. She was done, and she had left me with the wreckage of what remained. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone screen, my mind reeling. What now? What did this mean for me, for Jimmy, for the future we were supposed to have? As if on cue, the front door opened, and there stood Jimmy, holding a small, crumpled envelope in his hands. He walked over to me slowly, his face a mixture of confusion and sadness. I found this in Mom's room, he said, handing me the envelope. She said she didn't want me to read it, but I think you need to see it. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from Carrie, written just hours before she had left. Jim, I've made mistakes that can never be fixed. I'm sorry for everything, for the lies, for the pain, for the betrayal. No, I can never undo what I've done, but I need to say this. I love you, but I love my kids more. I need to find myself again, Jim. I can't keep living in the shadow of what I've done. Please take care of Jimmy and Allison. They need you now more than ever. I'll always be there for them, but I can't stay here any longer. The letter was painful to read. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was more of an admission, an acceptance of what she had done and why she couldn't stay. Carrie had decided to leave. She had walked away from everything, from the life we had built, from the man she had once loved, and from our children. I stood there, my heart heavy, trying to process it all. In that moment, I realized something. I had been holding on to a version of Carrie that no longer existed. The woman I had loved was gone, and the person she had become was someone I couldn't recognize. But even as the truth settled in, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for her. She was lost, just as I had been. She had made a choice, and now she was living with the consequences. As the days passed, I focused on what I could control, my kids. I started the process of adjusting to this new reality, of being a father to two children who had been through too much. But I also knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to make the same mistakes again. I would be there for Jimmy. I would be there for Allison. And I would never let my past define me.